Algoma Steel has signed a binding memorandum of understanding with South Korean shipbuilder Hanwha Ocean to the tune of $345 million. The signing ceremony took place earlier today with Ontario Trade Minister Vic Fedeli in attendance. It's predicated on the South Korean business winning the federal contract to build a fleet of submarines for the Canadian military.
Canada has just pulled off one of the most significant industrial moves of the year. Algoma Steel secured a $345 million partnership tied directly to South Korea's bid to build Canada's next fleet of submarines. A deal that doesn't just revive Ontario steel, but shifts the balance of power in North America's supply chains. At a time when Donald Trump believes he can squeeze Canada with escalating tariffs, regulatory threats, and geopolitical pressure, Ottawa has quietly taken a critical piece of the defense industrial puzzle out of America's hands and anchored it inside a new Canada-Korea ecosystem. This is the clearest signal yet that Canada has stopped playing by Washington's script.
The agreement between Algoma Steel and Hanwha Ocean commits up to $345 million for the construction of a structural steel beam mill in Sault Ste. Marie if South Korea wins the contract to deliver up to 12 Canadian Patrol Submarine Project vessels. This investment immediately changes the trajectory of Canada's heavy industry landscape. For Algoma, it is a path to restore lost jobs and rebuild long-term industrial capacity. For Hanwha, it is an entry point into one of the most strategically important defense procurements Canada has undertaken in decades. The deal fits seamlessly into Ottawa's Buy Canadian policy, which requires major foreign bidders to produce real domestic industrial benefits. Canada isn't simply buying ships, it is restructuring its own industrial base. And this arrives just as Canada debates another procurement question, the choice between the US F-35 and Sweden's Gripen. If the F-35 ties Canada even deeper into US dependency, the Gripen offers more control over training, maintenance, and intellectual property. In many ways, that debate mirrors today's steel decision. Canada is choosing diversification, flexibility, and sovereignty over automatic alignment with Washington.
In early 2026, Washington's pressure campaign shifted into a new phase. After Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where he warned of a fractured global system and urged middle-power democracies to diversify their economic ties, the White House reacted with visible irritation. Carney's remarks were interpreted as a direct challenge to Washington's habit of using trade as leverage, and Trump wasted no time responding. He first threatened Canada with a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods should Ottawa move forward with deeper engagement with China. Then he turned eastward, targeting South Korea with a sudden tariff hike, raising duties on Korean autos, lumber, and pharmaceuticals from the negotiated 15% ceiling to 25%, a punitive response to Seoul's slow movement on a U.S. trade framework. The message was unmistakable. If a partner did not align with America's political priorities, economic pressure would follow. And the escalation continued. On January 29th, Trump pushed the confrontation into unprecedented territory by announcing plans to hit Canadian aerospace exports with 50% tariffs, while simultaneously threatening to decertify Bombardier's Global Express aircraft unless Canada aligned its certification decisions with U.S. demands. It was a stunning blend of regulatory coercion and trade retaliation, directed squarely at one of Canada's most important high-tech sectors. These moves came against a broader backdrop of U.S. pressure over Arctic security and Greenland policy, but the real pattern was simpler. Washington was squeezing both Canada and South Korea at the exact moment the two countries were deepening defense industrial cooperation. That is what makes the Algoma-Hanwha Steel deal so strategically powerful. Instead of caving to tariff threats, Canada responded by re-engineering its supply chain, tying a major defense procurement to domestic steel production and a long-term partnership with a country that is also facing U.S. pressure. The deal isn't just an industrial investment, it is a structural countermove against Washington's leverage. By shifting submarine-grade steel production into Canada, Ottawa reduces the number of economic choke points the United States can exploit and strengthens an alternative network that connects Canadian workers and Korean capital outside of Washington's reach.
Washington has long treated Canada's industrial base as an extension of its own, assuming that Canadian shipyards, steel mills, and aerospace manufacturers would ultimately depend on American suppliers. That assumption no longer holds. With this deal, Canada begins shifting core components of its defense supply chain back home. High-strength steel for submarine hulls will no longer be exposed to American tariffs or political uncertainty. And the deeper Canada builds this domestic capacity, the less influence Washington retains over Canadian industrial decisions. Just as the Gripen proposal challenges the idea that Canadian air power must be American-built, the Algoma Hanwha plan challenges the belief that North American naval production must flow through U.S. supply lines.
Carney has been explicit. Canada must become the customer of its own economic strength. This deal is the clearest practical example of that philosophy. Instead of purchasing foreign hardware and accepting foreign dependencies, Canada is using procurement to expand domestic capabilities, worker skills, industrial output, and supply chain resilience. It is a shift from passive procurement to active statecraft, and it represents a Canada that sees industrial sovereignty not as an aspiration, but as a strategic requirement.
For decades, the United States assumed that major Canadian defense programs, especially submarines, would naturally fall under American influence, whether through materials, certification, or intellectual property. But Canada's pivot toward Korea signals a different future. South Korea is emerging as a global powerhouse in advanced shipbuilding, and it is willing to invest heavily in Canada to win the contract. For Trump, this is not just a commercial loss, it is a loss of leverage. Tariffs no longer push Canada back into the American orbit, when Canada is actively building economic partnerships that bypass Washington. Every investment that strengthens Canadian autonomy weakens Washington's assumption of Canadian compliance.
The Algoma Hanwha deal is not a reaction, it is preparation. Canada is designing a future where critical inputs for national defense cannot be disrupted by U.S. politics, U.S. tariffs, or U.S. regulatory threats. If the F-35 debate hinted at Canada's desire for more sovereignty in the air, and if Carney's Davos speech signaled a philosophical break from the old dependency model, then this steel mill is the material proof that the shift is real. Canada isn't just diversifying partners. Canada is positioning itself to withstand pressure and even outmaneuver it.
Viewed narrowly, a $345 million steel investment may look like industrial policy, but in the context of tariff threats, aerospace retaliation, and a U.S. government pressuring both Canada and Korea at the same time, it becomes something much larger. If Hanwha wins the submarine contract, Canada will not only receive new underwater capability, it will gain a strengthened industrial base, a domestic steel source insulated from tariffs, and a long-term partnership that Washington cannot easily disrupt. And the question now is unavoidable. If Canada can reclaim steel, diversify its air power, and build submarines outside the U.S. orbit, what exactly is left for Trump to leverage?
More than 300 South Korean workers were detained during that raid, suspected of living and working in the U.S. illegally.
Well, this is a low point right now in at least recent U.S.-South Korea relations. And really, relations are hugely important, we know.
From the perspective of companies, they will be concerned about disadvantageous treatment or facing difficulties when they're building factories in the United States. That could probably have a significant impact on direct investment in the U.S. in the future.
Hyundai could choose Canada for its next major North American plant, and this is far from impossible. In fact, after the chaos unleashed by the mass deportation raid in Georgia, Canada suddenly looks like the safer, more predictable, and more strategically aligned partner for South Korea's flagship automaker. What only months ago seemed like a U.S.-centered expansion plan is now being quietly reevaluated. Hyundai's confidence in the United States was shaken, Seoul was embarrassed, and investors across Asia started asking how long they can continue tolerating the political volatility Trump has reintroduced into America's economic landscape. In this moment of uncertainty, Canada is no longer a secondary option. It is emerging as a serious contender. The turning point came in September 2025, when U.S. immigration authorities surged into the Hyundai LG battery plant in Elabel, Georgia, arresting almost 500 workers in what authorities called the largest industrial raid in modern American history. Overnight, a multi-billion-dollar clean energy project was thrown into paralysis. Construction stopped. Timelines evaporated. Hyundai's leadership was blindsided, and the South Korean government demanded immediate explanations from Washington. Hyundai described the event as shocking. LG Energy Solution called it disruptive and destabilizing. Reuters noted that several Korean corporations were now reconsidering their risk exposure inside the United States, especially in industries requiring large, specialized workforces. While this chaos unfolded, Canada was demonstrating a very different posture. At the APEC summit in Gyeongju, Prime Minister Mark Carney held substantive talks with South Korean President Lee Jae-myung. The two leaders reaffirmed their cooperation in energy, technology, defense, supply chains, and critical minerals. They signed a new security and defense cooperation partnership, an unprecedented step for Canada's engagement with Korea. At the exact moment the U.S. was breaking trust with Seoul, Canada was strengthening it.
For decades, Hyundai's North American strategy revolved around the United States. The market was huge, incentives were attractive, and political conditions appeared stable enough to justify long-term investment. But that calculation changed in Trump's second term. Tariffs fluctuate without consistency. Immigration enforcement is unpredictable, and supply chains can be disrupted not by economic conditions, but by political theatrics. Hyundai's experience in Georgia has made one thing clear: the United States can no longer guarantee the stable environment a multi-billion-dollar plant requires. Every year the risk grows, and the confidence that once anchored foreign investment is nowhere near what it used to be. Canada, by contrast, can offer exactly what the U.S. no longer can. Carney's government operates through consistent industrial strategy. Regulations are transparent. Immigration is treated as a strength, not a political weapon. And Canada's long-term emphasis on skilled labor, clean energy, and predictable policy gives investors something rare in North America: peace of mind.
We have what the world wants. Take on the energy side, we are an energy superpower. Our top 5 in 10 of the world's most important critical minerals. We are a leading developer of AI. We have the resources the world needs. We have the talent to turn that potential into growth. We're a reliable partner. We're connected more than anyone else through trading relationships with any other part of the world.
Canada also brings real industrial capacity to the table. Ontario remains one of the most sophisticated auto manufacturing regions in the world, supported by decades of experience building vehicles for global brands. Its supplier networks, labor force, and logistical infrastructure are already integrated with global automakers. A Hyundai plant would plug seamlessly into this ecosystem. There is also the mineral advantage. Canada holds massive reserves of nickel, cobalt, copper, and lithium, the very resources required for EV batteries. At a time when the world is scrambling for secure and friendly supply chains, Canada offers Hyundai a natural, legally stable, geopolitically aligned source of battery materials. In that sense, Canada is not just an alternative to the U.S., it is a better aligned long-term fit. Diplomacy matters deeply in industries where supply chains stretch across continents. And here, the difference between Ottawa and Washington is stark. At APEC, Trump declined to meet Carney. Carney responded by meeting Xi Jinping, Lee Jae-myung, and several Indo-Pacific leaders shaping the future of energy and manufacturing. His approach signaled that Canada is not operating in America's shadow. It is charting its own path. For Korea, Carney's tone mattered. It showed respect, predictability, and long-term alignment. When set against Trump's increasingly unpredictable rhetoric and punitive actions, Canada appeared calm and cooperative, two qualities Hyundai now values more than ever. Only a year ago, the idea of Hyundai opening a major plant in Canada seemed unrealistic. But after the Georgia raid, the logic shifted. Canada has the talent. It has the minerals. It has trade agreements that eliminate friction. It has political stability. It has a government focused on Asia, not hostile to it. And, unlike in the U.S., Hyundai would not need to worry about its workforce being detained on camera during a morning police sweep. What was once a hypothetical scenario now feels entirely plausible. If Hyundai announced that its next major EV or battery plant would be in Canada, the impact would be immediate and enormous. Economists would expect thousands of direct jobs and many more indirect positions across logistics, metals, minerals, parts manufacturing, research, and regional development.
Provinces like Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, and British Columbia would compete aggressively for it, offering land, workforce guarantees, and incentives. Diplomatically, the symbolism would be even sharper. A major South Korean automaker shifting expansion from the U.S. to Canada would signal that American political risk is no longer tolerable. Other global manufacturers, Japanese, European, or Southeast Asian, would notice. They would begin running their own calculations, and Washington would find itself facing the consequences of its own unpredictability. For the U.S., this would not just be an economic loss, it would be a reputational blow. And for South Korea, it would mark the moment its corporations finally stopped absorbing the cost of American political chaos. And beyond the immediate numbers, the long-term implications could be transformational. A Hyundai plant would anchor new supply chain corridors, stimulate mining development in Canada's northern regions, and accelerate domestic battery research. It could also trigger a wave of follow-up investment from Korean suppliers, companies that traditionally cluster around Hyundai wherever it sets up shop. In effect, one decision from Hyundai could reshape Canada's entire industrial landscape for a generation, making the country a true North American manufacturing pillar rather than a peripheral player. Hyundai never wanted to rethink its North American strategy, but the United States forced that reconsideration upon them. The mass deportation raid cracked the foundation of trust. The inconsistent tariffs widened that crack, and every politically motivated enforcement action pushed Hyundai a little further away. Canada, meanwhile, has quietly positioned itself as the rational alternative, stable, predictable, globally connected, and diplomatically respectful. So now the question is simple. If Hyundai must choose between Trump's volatility and Carney's stability, why wouldn't it choose Canada? This is no longer unthinkable. This is increasingly logical, and it may soon become reality.
Governor Scott was very clear on his messaging about the impacts of tariffs on Canada and U.S. He's totally against the tariffs. He's a Republican who actually voted against the tariffs, and he stands firm that tariffs are not something that we should be talking about between friends. He was almost apologetic.
Yeah, a lot of that.
For the tariffs that are being imposed on Canada at the time.
Canada has just experienced one of the most unexpected moments of this entire U.S.-Canada trade war. A Republican governor openly apologizing to Canada for Donald Trump's tariffs. Not a Democrat, not an independent, a sitting Republican governor. And he didn't sugarcoat it. He said the tariffs were wrong, damaging, and hurting Americans more than Canadians. At the exact same time, Prime Minister Mark Carney is preparing a major new support package for softwood lumber and steel, two industries Trump has deliberately targeted. The timing is not an accident. Canada is building a stronger national economic shield just as Trump's tariff strategy begins to crack from within the United States. This moment says something bigger. The U.S. is starting to fracture under Trump's own policies, and Canada is stepping into a position of unity and strength. The turning point came during a joint gathering of Atlantic premiers and New England governors. Vermont Governor Phil Scott, a well-known Republican, told Canadian leaders that he was strongly opposed to Trump's tariffs and was, in his own words, almost apologetic for what Washington was doing. For a governor from Trump's own party to say that publicly is extraordinary. Newfoundland and Labrador Premier Tony Wake then revealed that the premiers had discussed the entire tariff situation directly with Prime Minister Carney. According to Wake, Carney confirmed that Ottawa is preparing a significant package for softwood lumber and steel, two sectors Trump has repeatedly hit with tariffs throughout 2025. Wake explained that Carney also committed to more frequent meetings with all premiers, something Canada hasn't seen in years, signaling a coordinated national response. Meanwhile, the economic backdrop continues to shift.
Trump has pushed U.S. tariffs on Canadian goods outside USMCA up to around 35%, creating serious strain on tourism, retail, and energy-adjacent states that rely heavily on Canadian visitors and cross-border trade. Statistics Canada recently showed a sharp decline in Canadian travel to the U.S., leaving border towns in northern New England struggling. That is the real reason Phil Scott apologized. His state is taking the hit. Behind the scenes, Carney is juggling several fronts at once. Canada's federal budget already includes industrial tax credits, nation-building infrastructure, and the new Major Projects Office aimed at speeding up mega-projects across the country. Now, a tailored program for steel and lumber appears to be next. Reuters and CBC reporting confirm that Carney is moving in that direction, and the premiers seem fully aligned with him. Trump's second-term trade agenda was built on the belief that Canada would eventually give in simply because of its proximity and economic ties to the U.S. The logic was simple. Hit Canada hard enough, and the pressure will eventually force concessions. But that assumption no longer fits reality. Canada has spent the entire year diversifying its trade, especially towards Asia and Europe. The Reuters numbers are clear. Canadian exports to the U.S., while still significant, have fallen as Canadian companies move aggressively to new markets. That shift alone weakens Trump's leverage. At the same time, the U.S. is dealing with the consequences of its own actions. American refiners still rely on Canadian heavy crude, American home builders still depend on Canadian lumber, and U.S. manufacturers still need Canadian steel and key minerals. When Trump disrupts those supply chains, Americans, not Canadians, absorb most of the damage. That is why Phil Scott apologized. He wasn't being diplomatic, he was acknowledging reality. Vermont's tourism is collapsing. Maine, New Hampshire, and upstate New York are facing similar pressures. Americans are feeling the impact of Trump's tariffs in ways they did not expect, and Republican governors are reaching their limit. This is where the political landscape becomes fascinating. A Republican governor siding with Canada over the Republican president is not normal. It signals an emerging split within the GOP, one where local economic survival matters more than party loyalty. For Canada, this is powerful leverage. When U.S. states begin pushing back against Washington, Canada suddenly has partners south of the border who can influence national policy from the inside. It creates a dynamic where Canada isn't fighting the United States. It's working with the parts of the United States that disagree with Trump. These states want Canadian tariffs back. They want cross-border trade restored. They want stable, predictable commercial ties. And they're saying so openly. And while Washington drifts into division, Ottawa is sharpening its focus, moving ahead with a plan that hits back where Trump aimed the hardest.
We talked about the budget, which was positive, an announcement on steel and softwood lumber that affects Ontario in a big way. He'll be addressing that over the next week or so.
Carney's upcoming package for lumber and steel is more than just economic support. It is a political message. It says that Canada will not be cornered, and it will not allow domestic industries to collapse because of Washington's political theater. Softwood lumber has been a target in nearly every U.S.-Canada dispute for 20 years. Steel and aluminum were brought back under national security language that even American officials admitted was flimsy. Trump revived those tools again in 2025, expecting Canada to complain but ultimately comply. Carney's approach is different. Rather than waiting for Washington to soften, Ottawa is stabilizing the entire supply chain at home. The federal budget's industrial incentives already give manufacturers new breathing room. The super deduction for productivity lets mills and smelters modernize at a discount. And with this new package, Carney is effectively drawing a line. Canadian workers and industries will be protected, with or without American cooperation. This is the clearest sign so far that Canada is preparing for long-term tension with Washington and is willing to rebuild its own industrial base to withstand it.
One of the most important details from Wake's interview was how committed Carney is to keeping premiers directly involved. For years, Canada's internal coordination was fragmented. Provinces often acted independently, reacting to U.S. policy on their own. Now under Carney, Canada is acting as a single strategic unit. Atlantic Canada is pushing for fisheries protection and energy development. Ontario is laser-focused on steel and manufacturing. British Columbia wants stability in softwood lumber. Quebec is renegotiating hydro deals. The prairies are adapting to global agriculture. Carney's message throughout these meetings has been consistent. Canada must stand united while the U.S. is divided. That unity is becoming a competitive advantage. A Republican governor apologized to Canada. The Atlantic premiers stood behind the Prime Minister, and a major steel and softwood package is about to land on the national stage. All of this is happening as Trump's tariff war falters under its own economic weight. Canada isn't bowing. Canada isn't breaking. Canada is building. And the real question going forward is simple. If U.S. states are already rebelling against Trump's strategy, how long can Washington hold the line before its own economy forces a retreat? That's the story every North American leader will be watching in the months ahead. Canada just delivered one of the clearest signs yet that the era of quiet deference to Washington is over. After a high-level virtual meeting with Prime Minister Mark Carney, Ontario Premier Doug Ford stepped in front of reporters and delivered a message that captured the country's new direction with stunning clarity.
I want to thank the Prime Minister for traveling around the world and getting Canada out front and making sure that we diversify our trade with other countries.
It wasn't a throwaway line. It was an unmistakable signal that even Ontario, the province most economically tied to the United States and usually the most cautious in moments of Canada-US tension, is now fully aligned with Carney's global pivot. At a time when Donald Trump's administration is imposing sweeping tariffs, freezing communication channels, and trying to pull allies back under American control, Ford's remarks confirmed something Washington hoped wasn't true. Canada is no longer waiting for the United States. It is rewriting its place in the world and winning partners Trump never expected Ottawa to secure. What Ford said wasn't just praise for a prime minister. It was an acknowledgement of a new Canadian strategy. Canada is stepping onto the world stage, deliberately, confidently, and independently. The remarks came on November 17, 2025, after Carney met virtually with all provincial and territorial leaders to discuss the federal budget and the state of Canada's relationship with the United States. Ford described the meeting as positive and unusually frank, noting that communication between Ottawa and Washington has all but collapsed. Negotiators are still working behind the scenes, but official dialogue remains frozen after months of tariff escalation. Ford explained that while the United States has been pushing for a sector-by-sector negotiation model, focusing on autos, steel, and softwood lumber, Canada cannot afford to sit idle waiting for an American breakthrough. Trump's administration has repeatedly leveraged tariffs as political weapons, and Reuters recently confirmed that Trump publicly declared he would not restart trade talks with Canada after Ottawa's economic messaging campaign frustrated his inner circle. Against that backdrop, Carney briefed the premiers on his fast-paced diplomatic push overseas. From Asia to Europe and the Middle East, Canada has reopened channels, signed new agreements, and secured investment opportunities that simply were not accessible during the previous diplomatic freeze. Ford emphasized that these efforts are not symbolic. They're reshaping where Canada sells its goods, where it sources critical minerals, and where its economic partnerships will come from in the next decade. The meeting also included updates on domestic sectors under strain, including steel and autos, which continue to absorb pressure from U.S. tariffs. Ford pressed for stronger protections and stricter quota management, arguing that Canada cannot be a dumping ground for low-cost global steel. Far more importantly, however, he highlighted the Prime Minister's broader strategy. Canada must strengthen itself at home while expanding its presence abroad. Ford's endorsement carried weight precisely because Ontario has historically been the province most intertwined with American supply chains. When a leader in that position says Canada must diversify, it reflects a major national consensus. The reality is simple. Canada can no longer afford to wait for the United States to resolve its internal chaos or clarify its trade objectives. Trump's tariff strategy has made unpredictability the new normal, and industries in Ontario have grown tired of operating in the shadow of U.S. political turbulence. Ford's remarks recognized a truth that Canadians have quietly understood for years but rarely said aloud. Canada has the talent, the resources, and the diplomatic capacity to stand on its own feet. Carney's strategy of traveling around the world is not about prestige, it is about securing alternatives so that when the United States slams a door, Canada does not stand stranded in the corridor. Trump's trade war with Canada was designed to corner Ottawa into submission. Instead, it has triggered the opposite reaction. Companies in both countries are reassessing supply chains, and in some cases, shifting operations north to avoid American volatility. Farmers and manufacturers in the Midwest, many of whom helped elect Trump, are now facing higher costs because Canadian counter-tariffs have redirected supply flows across the Pacific. Meanwhile, Canada's outreach is earning tangible results. Carney's meeting with Xi Jinping produced the first thaw in Canada-China relations since 2018. China invited Carney to Beijing for high-level talks in 2026, while Canada resumed cooperation in clean technology, tourism, and energy transition. In India, negotiations are restarting after years of political chill. Across ASEAN and the Indo-Pacific, Canada is expanding trade, defense, and energy partnerships with countries eager to reduce their own dependence on Washington. What makes this pivot so powerful is that it was forced into motion by Trump himself. Faced with unpredictable tariffs and stalled negotiations, Canada did what middle powers do when global giants falter. It built a better set of options. Traveling around the world undersells the scope of the shift. Carney is not visiting capitals for ceremonial handshakes. He is redrawing Canada's economic architecture. His strategy connects new partners in critical minerals, LNG supply, nuclear technology, AI, advanced manufacturing, and clean electricity. These are the sectors that will define global leadership for the next 30 years, and Canada is anchoring itself inside that future. The United States, meanwhile, is retreating behind tariff walls. Trump's approach relies on coercion and intimidation. Carney's relies on diversification and cooperation. One closes markets, the other opens them. For decades, U.S. policymakers assumed Canada would remain loyal by default, even when mistreated. Trump pushed that assumption past its breaking point. Ford's comments show the American miscalculation. Canada was not drifting away. It was preparing its escape route. And now that escape route is becoming the foundation of a more independent, more confident Canadian identity. Doug Ford's endorsement of Carney's global trade offensive marks a defining moment in modern Canadian politics. It signals the emergence of a unified national strategy, one that protects Canada at home while building influence abroad. Trump's tariffs were meant to weaken Canada, but they accelerated the country's most significant economic realignment in decades. The question now is how far this transformation will go. Will Canada lean even more heavily into Asia and Europe? Will Trump attempt new forms of retaliation? Or will this moment be remembered as the point when Canada finally realized that it did not need permission from Washington to shape its own future? One thing is already clear. Canada has stepped onto the world stage, and this time it's standing there on its own terms.